To tie together what's been some really fascinating discussions on a lot of different aspects, and I think really important, rich discussion, especially about how public space is such a dynamic, fluid thing, as you've heard from a number of speakers today, that it's complex, it's ever shifting, it's produced by the people themselves and by their actions, and often there's a subtle system of rules that's often tacit, as David pointed out, and those can change, especially when there's a fire and other events. And yet we do have to take normative positions, and you've heard that from a number of speakers today. We have to, as Emily pointed out, as Setha, Julian, and others pointed out, we have to kind of put stakes in the ground, as it were, and say this is what the framework is needed in order to make sure that there's social justice, that there's a framework of equitable life chances, as Julian pointed out. And we can ask also with Ali and with Don, what effects are our current economic processes in cities, the effects of real estate and so on, commodification of real estate. What effects are those having on the city? Really powerful, corrosive effects in many cases. And what choices are we taking or not taking to shape those forces and avoid having them wreak havoc on our cities, as is happening in so many cities today. And then, as Christine pointed out, we have to be wary of a similar destructive power in data and in the whole sort of smart cities movement, and be very careful about that and recognize that data is not this inert, wonderful thing that's just there. We all thought that 20 years ago about the internet, and we now recognize that that was a fallacy. And just so with smart cities, we in our database group, we were talking about the famous quote from Heisenberg that what we have to remember, what we're examining is not nature itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning. We bring our questions, we bring our values and our assumptions and our hypotheses to the city and to public space. And then I really appreciated Vikas's typology-led appraisal as a way to kind of get a handle on this fluidity and to identify the kinds of structures that, at least provisionally, at least as hypotheses, we can work with in terms of how we structure normative public space. And then finally, I was really struck by how closely, Matthew, your project is to the work that we're going to be talking about tomorrow and Thursday on our database project, which is very much a work in progress. And it's so great that we have, Matthew and I were talking earlier about how we might be able to collaborate and, create a larger effort, create something that we can sustain, because I think we're all talking about some of the same ideas of how do we get a handle on this issue for policy and for practice. And so I'm looking forward to some great discussions over the next couple of days. So now I'd like to turn it over to Massimo Santaniccia, am I pronouncing that right? Who is an architect, urbanist, planner, associate professor, and program director in architecture here at the Iceland University of the Arts in Reykjavik, and our host, as you were introduced earlier. Thank you. And would you like to make an initial comment and your point of view for starting off our discussion?
So thank you, Tigran, again for this wonderful event. For us in Iceland is always, we are honored to have you here. So I'm personally really, really happy. But I see myself mainly as an educator today, because Sigrun and I are working in this, probably say the smallest school of architecture in the world. So we don't only cover one specific position. We tend to do many things. And ultimately, the role of every school is to educate and to establish a dialogue with the next generation. So this idea of architecture, urbanism, in a way, they are about life. They are about how people live together, and they are about how we relate with our environment. So it's an incredibly vast topic of knowledge to cover. it's so vast that at times I feel overwhelmed. I mean, what shall we teach? I mean, if urbanism and architecture is about everything, where do we start, basically? So this is a little bit my question, and it's a very selfish question, because I need your piece of advice of what would you suggest that where shall we start, basically, with architecture, maybe even in the context of Iceland, in this remote place in the North Atlantic. What would you suggest us in terms of what shall we invest our energies the most? What would you think it's important for us to understand and to know and to teach?
And could I add to that also, do you think public space is kind of a platform that brings some of that together? Because since that's what we're talking about today, and I'd like to hear everybody's different thoughts about that in terms of integrating that into a curriculum. And
yes, I'm sorry, maybe I just want to say that for me architecture doesn't make sense without thinking of a public space.
Right.
And it's so, even when we operate far away from the city with our students, I say to the students, always think that every road will lead to a city. In this case, is probably Reykjavik or a few others. So we feel the urban presence even when we are far away, but also because Iceland is not as pristine as you can imagine. I mean, Iceland is still the result of profound anthropic transformations that, as you know, the Vikings started more than 1,000 years ago, and our landscape is never immune from basically human action, and therefore that always to me connects to the essence of how we live together, and therefore the public space. But Matthew, maybe I let you since you are closest.
Thank you very much. I remember back to my own education as an architect, and we started off designing a house, and by the end of the third year we designed an art gallery. And there was, I think just about every architect does the same thing. Never was there any mention of the city, of urban structure and urban form, or landscape, which, of course, here in Iceland is the sort of the thing which is everywhere, those incredible landscapes. And I would think that's the place to start, really. And I always regretted that wasn't the place that we started in our education. And I think still most architecture education doesn't start from really a deep dive into understanding the city, the context, and the landscape.
Emily?
Well, my thought is that luckily you do have a lot to work with. As you noted, there's almost too much information about public space, and it's wonderful that Michael and Tigran and Peter are sorting it all out. I think what I would probably do is sorry, and many others.
We're on it.
And many others, but I just will say that there are these wonderful typologies that people have thought through, Setha and Matthew and Vikas and others, and so you have these to work from, these typologies of public space, and then using those as a kind of framework to then go out and see if those are applicable to Iceland's, to Reykjavik's public spaces, I would think would be one way to start.
Right, as hypotheses, not as doctrines, right?
Right.
Bring them in as hypotheses, test them.
Well, one thing I agree with you that public space is part of the built environment, part of training to become a professional in the built environment, including architects and planners and others. So the urge to specialize and to focus on a narrow part of this built environment and not to think about the rest of it is not so, it doesn't give you an accurate picture of the world. It narrows down your focus. So I would encourage the students to look at totality of the built environment and obviously experiment with different parts of it, learn about different parts of it, but not to think of specializing as if it is a branch. I mean, even the medical doctors, they have to learn a bit about the whole body first before becoming specialist in a particular aspect of it. The other thing that I would say is that if, as you say rightly, that if the urban is about everything, then obviously the best thing that the students in this country or any other country, but this particular country that now you're talking about, is to learn about their own country, about their own society, not in the sense of just the environment, but its society, its history. And these are the things that I see some countries are very good. I've been in touch with various architecture programs around Europe, and I see some countries are so special, so narrowly focusing on the aesthetics of the environment, and not much, their students are not able to talk about their society at all. They are not socially literate. And it's very important for an architect. I mean, in the olden days, architects had the claim to reorganize the world. Why? Because they thought that they have an idea about society. But now even that has disappeared, and I suppose good thing that has happened. But in a way, for the architects not to know anything about their own society is really a tragedy.
So I'll just pick up on what Ali said. I think as a practical advice is to take your students for a walk and walk through an undetermined route where you as a teacher are as surprised or somewhat as surprised as the students, and experience public space and architecture together in the way the social processes are played out. And I think it's a very, very fun thing to do. I do that in my public space class without knowing where we will go. We just walk. And we pick up things. Sometimes we come out with not very much, but we might do it again. And I think that explains that what you're teaching them about designing a house is not in a void, that it's actually playing out in other things that are very likely in public, because the places you'll walk through are very likely going to be public first, and then perhaps other layers of semi-private or private. So as a practical advice, I'd say start there. Try and do a class as you walk.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me how
Thank you.
public space is such an interesting platform that brings a lot of these issues together. And yet, there's sort of a double-edged sword, because in some ways, we find working with public space, everybody can talk about it. Everybody says, yeah, I know public space. But then suddenly they're talking about different things. They're talking about parks or, so it's a fascinating way of uniting the conversation, but also it tends to pull it apart.
Yes, I'm also thinking that we talk about. We have talked about also diversities of how this can be further. Become really a component in our work, but also in a way to look at the city. So, but then again. Probably all my questions are very self-reflective, because I'm based here in Iceland, and this is a society that traditionally has been very homogeneous, but at the same time I read it as also very open to the world. So Icelanders are in a way highly educated. Education is supported also with the help of the state, so people have an easy access to education. So I'm thinking, how do you talk about diversity in a society that fundamentally is very homogeneous? And maybe all of you are in an incredibly cosmopolitan situation. So you are based in London and Newcastle, and so how would you address this question when you are actually in a very homogeneous society? And how relevant is the notion of diversity in this context?
So if I can ask everybody to answer kind of briefly, because we want to turn it over to the next group of folks. And this.
We have 5 minutes. So.
Okay, great. Matthew.
That's a tough question. I've never really thought about it. I mean, yeah, teaching in London, it's just a sort of given that that you're teaching to an incredibly diverse class, and that's just part of the context. I suppose travel, that's the thing that I always say to my students. The greatest way of learning is to go and see other places, and everywhere, Iceland included, is so connected in these days, and you can just travel and see other places and see how other places do it. And just watching all the slides that are up there today and all those great examples of public space challenges, things that go right, things that go wrong. We all do it different. And there's constantly things, coming to an event like this, constantly things you haven't seen and you learn more. You think public space, that would be quite a limited subject, but this constantly surprises me. So travel, get them traveling, I think.
Yeah. By the way, Matthew, there's a great tour that you can take just out of London that I've taken students on there for 2 weeks, and you can almost recapitulate the whole history of at least European urbanism. Quite a great tour. And by the way, Massimo just mentioned the book project, and that's another thing that is going to be an outcome of this conference, and we're all going to be contributing. So no pressure, but you need to be thinking about your chapters.
Get thinking.
Yikes. Well, I'll just say that I think every place has diversity in it. You might define it in different ways. I mean, maybe you don't have a lot of racial diversity or ethnic diversity, but you have age diversity. You have, family type diversity. You have different types of people and different walks of life coming together. And I guess as an architect, I would think you would be really interested in how the built environment is enabling or getting in the way of that diversity being successful wherever it does exist. So I've been really involved in Chicago in figuring out with Lou Cancelin where the diversity is, because really the focus is on segregation and how we have homogeneous neighborhoods. And we're very, very, as a society, as academics tend to be very focused on that, and nobody really digs down on, well, there is diversity in the city, and where does that exist, and how can we kind of celebrate it without undermining it. And so I guess if I were you, I would look for those pockets of diversity where they are spatially and see what's going on there.
Yes, I was going to say almost the same thing, that the assumption that this is a homogeneous society has to be revisited, because it is already a diverse society, has always been, in the sense of, do we take for granted the way, let's say, women and men are related to each other? Do we take for granted the way older and younger people relate to each other? These are we take for granted, and then think about homogeneity in those terms. Whereas if you think differently, these are questions for revisiting. At the same time, yes, now populations are becoming more diverse, people are more mobile, and you get visitors, tourists, new residents, new inhabitants, and so obviously it's a new experience. And I see how in societies where this is new, obviously it takes time for people to get used to new faces, new races, new populations. And it's the main thing, perhaps, a way to deal with it is to normalize it for people who just come out of their childhood and enter the university, and they may not have come across people of different, even villages. If they are urban people, they may not have seen people from villages, and vice versa. So it's a new experience, and if you can create that interface for them of seeing and being with others and seeing they are humans like us, and that empathizing that is possible, and particularly in young people, there is masses of that capacity, much more than older people. That is a way forward, perhaps.
So without repeating many things, I think there's an inherent diversity even in a homogeneous place like this, where you have tourists who come in and recreate the landscape. And I was told by the taxi driver that their tourism season is expanding to almost 12 months. I don't know whether that's true or not, but regardless, the tourism industry creates a very diverse way that places are understood and transformed. Whether it's gentrification at the pace of other places or not, it's what people from outside expect and what insiders expect, and therein lies diversity. This could be an experiment in trying to see how, in a slow changing place, perhaps like this, those two processes can be played out in a way that they work better than other places where there are tens of dozens of other complexities in diversity. So in some ways, you have a very interested, controlled experiment where you have the time to think about perhaps limited diversity that you're talking about, and perhaps looking at that from the way that the insiders and outsiders see space, use space, and trying to make something out of that.
Great. You know, a number of people have brought up Jane Jacobs today, and her most important ingredient for great cities and great public spaces was diversity. And so that's a great note to close on. So thank you to our panel.
Thank you very much. Okay, then I'll ask David to come here, and we'll add 2 chairs if we can. 2 chairs, yeah? Because we have 6. Seta, Dawn, Julian, Christine, David, and none. 6. No, we're 6.
I'll stand.
Do you want to stand? Okay.
I'm happy to stand for a minute.
There's a chair.
Okay. I want to tower above everyone.
You always did.
I knew it was coming. Somehow I knew this was coming.
Actually, we've got next to David.
Sit next to David. Sit next to David. Next to David. Should stick together.
I think it should go boy, girl.
Okay. Now, if everybody would shift one seat, then you could be seen.
Oh, I can't be seen.
You're behind the podium.
No one's too much.
Oh, I see.
Come. Okay.
But now I'm on the end. Oh.
A room full of planners and designers of space, and they couldn't figure that out.
Analyze the
Okay.
structure.
Well, I have sort of a challenging role to try to ask a question that ties this all together, and what I want to do, I think, is ask one big question that comes to me probably as the result of being a social scientist who understands that architects don't want to listen to me. I've run into that. I understand that. If we think about where the day started, you know, we had from Matthew Carmona this wonderfully detailed articulation, empirically grounded, of the value propositions associated with public space. And then Ali Madanapour suggested in rethinking public space a question that often is something that I wonder about, that with all these propositions or the value of public space, the question remains, for whom and by whom is it being produced? And we heard from Setha about the context of liberalism. I love the discussion of incomplete streets. For me, that raises a lot of interesting questions about the way people talk about public space in terms that are race and class blind on purpose. The word vibrant has started to really rub me the wrong way for that reason. It's like, we want a vibrant public space. Lively, vibrant, and all that. Christine Boyer, points out that the technology is never neutral, and that there's this long history of this impulse to reduce planning to sort of technocratic algorithms. We'd love to be able to do that and avoid politics altogether, but it's, as everyone understands, a fundamentally political activity in good ways, right? That's a positive thing about it. And then, of course, we have Don Mitchell's articulation of the big context of land as property, which really raises some huge questions. So here's my question. There's this huge gap then between the rhetoric of public space, what designers and planners think they're trying to do or believe that they're able to do when they create great public spaces, and this whole range of outcomes that is determined much more by context, both context at the level of the activity that's going on, as David Cantor describes, the detailed activity, but also the detailed activity in the larger context of these big structures that are pretty much always beyond the pay grade of planners and designers. So I really continually wonder how we get back from those big questions about this broader context to helping designers and planners actually do their jobs in a way that engages some of these big questions successfully. Or is it simply that it seems to me that that very often it's rearranging the deck chairs on a ship that's steaming very strongly in a direction that they're not controlling. Not to say that it's hitting icebergs or anything. So how can we get designers and planners to engage with the bigger and more fundamental questions in a productive way that contributes to our ability socially and politically to engage those questions as well, right? So that so that the professional experts are not just the technocratic handmaidens of the accumulation of capital, but in fact engaging the big political issues. So, Setha, would you like to jump in?
Yeah. I was sort of hoping that my presentation answered your question, so clearly I wasn't very clear. I think my first answer would be, if you're going to use your analogy, they should be getting in front of the boat. They should be jumping in front of this steamship that is going downstream. I just think that we need to make a much clearer demand. If you're talking about we being now public space people, a much clearer demand and do it empirically, that one, the importance of public space and why it matters, of which we already have that. I think we have it. But number two, I think we have to make a kind of normative political stance that planners and designers, and maybe not architects, maybe we can never talk to where's Christine? Maybe we can never get to the architects, but they're radical. Again, remember, I work in Latin America and in Africa, where architects are radicals, and architects are right at the, or in Croatia, where architects are right there with us in the room. So we're talking about certain things that we talk about the values and the norms and what it is we're trying to do collectively, and that with that then we change two things. One, perspective, that it be multi-level, as I was trying to say, that we'd have to be able to think citywide and site-specific, and we need to offer more methods and ways in so that they are able to have the encounters that we're suggesting seem to be so important. Everybody, you keep talking about make it people-centered. Well, how is it that the planner, the designer, or the architect is actually encountering those people and changing their lives so that they too can do something different? But they are the handmaidens.
You sure?
I am. No, I'm never sure. No, everyone who knows me knows I'll never be.
Okay, thank you. Well, two things. None of us has mentioned pop-up urbanism today. For a lot of us, sitting around and discussing and debating was part of how we got things to change. My students don't want that. One of the reasons why my students are into urban agriculture is, you can change a place in a day into an urban farm and you can see results. They want results. And so I think in many ways, a lot of younger people and the whole pop-up phenomenon, guerrilla gardening, guerrilla urbanism, is changing places. And woe betide any local council that wants to try and change it back from a beautiful, urban garden to the vacant lot that it was. And so in many ways, I think that gap is being filled by these largely younger people. Second, none of us has mentioned the most spectacular of urban transformations, like Medellin, and the vision of social urbanism, which is just sustainability's FYI. This idea of mayors having a vision, a philosophy, is quite alien to us in the north, global north, but in Latin America, you've got the most radical urban food system in Belo Horizonte. You had Curitiba, you had Porto Alegre, you had Bogotá with Antanas Mocas and Peñalosa. You've now got Medellin, which is, you know, a transformation among transformations. Part of it, I think, is that these mayors had a vision rather than, say, the mayor of Boston, who just juggles between unions, developers, and concerned citizens. And that's his job, basically. I don't think he's capable of real visioning. You know, really, I don't think he is. But I think mayors of some of these Latin American cities can actually engage the public. And what's really interesting, if you look at the Medellin city plan, the focus is on creating public spaces as spaces of engagement. It actually mentions this in there. And so I think they get it, that, you know, spaces of engagement, spaces of encounter. I like the concept of contact theory. Contact theory, you know, contact amongst people who are different tends to, other things being equal, release more empathetic and more sympathetic reactions amongst people. So I think that gap, in many ways, is being filled in Latin American cities by visionary mayors who can really bridge and focus on the most disadvantaged communities, as they did in Medellin.
And I feel a bit of an outsider in all this, observing it, and what has impressed me today is been the sort of honesty of presentations and the richness of people's understanding that actually the planners and designers and architects are not the most influential people, and that there are political and economic forces, as well as all huge cultural changes that we are all trying to relate to. And I'm actually reminded of one of the few occasions in which I did contribute to the design of a major research complex, and it's interesting. It was a research centre for the company that makes oils and Shell, and they knew about research, and they called me and said that they were building a new building and they wanted a proper brief, and I did a lot of work with them in terms of developing the brief, and they insisted that that was presented to the architect, and the architect said this was wonderful, he was going to deal with it, and then he produced a design that was just like the design he'd done for the last building he'd done. And I pointed that out to the client, and what was really interesting, and I've never seen it before, they sacked the architect. In other words, the client made the decision as to what they wanted and how they wanted to relate to their own activities. And that's very unusual, because architects particularly are so, I mean, they're educated in how to manipulate others. The crit, the architectural crit, which I think still happens today. When I was in a school of architecture, they put their drawings up, often some of them had knocked them up the night before. But if they could sell it, they'd get a good mark for it. When I worked in the School of Architecture, they were trying to get them to have an empirical base for the designs, but that faded a long time ago. So architects are actually trained in how to sell ideas, but it seems to me that needs to be embraced very directly in relation to all the issues. Seth has actually gone out of her way to talk about how you reach out, but it seems to me the message I'm getting from everybody here is you've all got to develop those skills in getting people to listen. Where you've got a client, a mayor, who wants to do it, fine. Where you've got small-scale events, and it strikes me that you can make a big impact at the small level with urban guerrilla gardening and those sort of things, and that's great for students, for them to learn how they have an impact. And that seems to me the skill that, in a sense, is lacking in all of this is how the hell do you get it out there for people so that people have to take it on board. And it probably means that possibly some people in this room have got to get into politics, got to get into senior positions of authority, where they can actually have that influence. Like, I bet you these mayors that do this have got a background. Some of them may have been architects, may have been planners. They've got a background in how to do it, and students often think, particularly in the sciences and in psychology, think that if they've come up with a great finding, it's going to change the world. And I always like to point out that during the Second World War, Barnes Wallis designed a bomb that was going to have very special impact. And they could demonstrate it, and it went bang the way he predicted. It still took him 3 years in the middle of the war for anybody to take any notice. And the fact that you've got good ideas it's not the same thing as people actually using them and taking them on board. There's a whole other issue. I talk about 4.5 research styles, and the half one is consultancy, because a consultant is somebody who goes in who wants to change what he's studying. And that takes totally different skills. I mean, in this area that I've been involved in offender profiling, there's a number of complete charlatans and cranks around who the police listen to. And then police listen to them because they go for a drink with them, they're a good laugh, they're nice chaps. The minute the police ask them, they'll drop everything and they'll run out to come and help them. And they're prepared to engage with them. And the police listen to them, although what they talk is complete crap most of the time, and has got the police into some terrible difficulties. But that doesn't stop them dealing with these individuals because they relate to them. And I've always said that those skills, being able to tell a joke, being able to relate, knowing what to wear, how to relate to the individuals, all of those communication skills with the other is important. And it makes me think, although this has been a great event and I found it enormously valuable, one of the missing components is the money men, the people who make the decisions about development, they probably wouldn't listen to it, but it's a start to get in the builders and the financiers and those individuals. I know I rabbit on, but we did a whole study on the way in which psychics have their impact, that convince people that what they're doing is sensible. And we ran a conference where we brought in a psychic who, at the end of the day, was going to talk. And throughout the day, we talked about all the mechanisms they use and why it's all so distorted. And then this guy stood up and gave a talk as if nobody had said any of that, and it actually illustrated all the things we'd been saying about all the sort of generalities and what have you that they come up with. So what I'm saying is that bridging is actually extremely difficult. And we can talk to each other. This is preaching to the converted here. I don't think anybody pretty well disagreed with anybody else, which is a great way, and it's very important to support people, but to get out there and do something is a whole other ball game.
I think it's important to remind ourselves that those of us who get into these fields, all of us in this room and all of our students, really want to make the world a better place. Almost all of them do. And I think it's our jobs as educators to enable that more than anything, is to enable that so then they become the practitioners who are doing it. So the question is, how do we enable that? I mean, students come in super idealistic. They want to enrich places for people and the planet. They want to make a better life for everybody. And yet we critique our professions a lot, particularly the architects, right? But they are idealistic when they come in. And we don't want to, through those crits that you mentioned where they learn to be salespeople, that's a good example of what we need to change. So how do we do that? Well, one of the things is to really get them in touch with why they came, and to just ask the simple question, and I think you said something about Nietzsche saying, if you give me the why, I can give you the how, to ask them why. Why do they want to be an architect? Why do they want to be a planner? I mean, just really simple stuff. Ask them why so they can remind themselves. And to have them continually journaling and sketching about what's going on with them. So they connect with themselves. They don't lose that idealism. They don't lose that aspiration to make the world a better place. They get more and more in touch with it as they're learning the skills in school. I think that's really important to continue that going. And then there's the connecting with others. And you cannot connect with other people if you're not connected with yourself, because there's always this voice inside of you that's kind of screaming in your ear, and if you don't listen to it, it's too loud for you to hear anyone else, because you're always thinking what's going on inside of you, and you can't be open to what others are hearing. So it's first to teach students, allow them to listen to themselves, then they are enabled to listen to others, truly listen to others, whether it's their classmates, whether it's their team members on a larger interdisciplinary team, whether it's the larger community, and this sets the stage for them to go out and be practitioners. And we all have in our schools and in our universities lots of different disciplines. That's something we need to do too, is bring in the real estate students, and bring in the business students, and the engineers, and the sociologists, and the computer engineers. Bring in everybody, and the sociologists, and the psychologists, and to have those conversations so they learn the social skills, they learn how to translate. So yes, they learn the jargon in their own fields, that's part of their education. But they learn to be able to translate that jargon for whomever they happen to be speaking with, to learn those social skills. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to listen to themselves, listen to others, and then make things happen in the best possible way. That gets to that sideways urbanism I talked about, as many as possible, as soon as possible.
I think it's a fundamental responsibility of scholars and teachers to disabuse people, including students, of their idealism, but not their ideals. I think we need to understand the world as it really is, not as we wish it were, so that we can make it the way that we want it to be. And I think those are fundamentally different things. And I think they're very, very important. So a fundamental responsibility of us, who are in positions like we are, is to do research, and to do very deep research, and to take the time to do research. Of course, to learn ways to communicate it, but also to speak up to people, not to speak down to them, as we often do when we think about communicating with those who are not within the academy. People are smart, and they're desperate for good information. They want to see their worlds exposed so they can begin to understand how to transform them. And so I think it's fundamentally important that we take the time to go to the library, however virtual that may be now, and to do the work necessary to trace out those patterns of capital flow, to show the ways in which we and others are, in fact, the handmaidens of that. And then begin to think about ways in which we can politicize that whole process in order to transform it.
I think you can probably guess how I might answer this question. I agree with most of what has been said, to follow the trend of this conference or this symposium. But I also wanted to answer epistemological question. I think that's the most important thing that academics can do. So I think I agree with you to elevate this discourse to know it's not a matter of just students learning to listen. They have to have a vocabulary to speak with. They have to know what that vocabulary means. So if we just start with terms that are thrown out that are buzzwords. We've talked a little bit about this. Gentrification is one of those terms. It doesn't mean anything anymore. So it has to be criticized. It has to be looked at epistemologically in terms of its roots, in terms of its history, in terms of how it's being applied, by whom, and so forth. I think that's the role of an academic. I think that's where we can intervene. The smart city, obviously, is another area, the algorithms that I talked about and so on. Land and capital and property is certainly a whole other area of vocabulary and concept formation. If you're here in Reykjavik, if you're in Hong Kong, if you're teaching architecture, wherever, and please, you need to learn how to talk to architects. So you need to be able to define what it is. How can you teach architects about social science? How can you make it so they understand, rather than say, well, we won't talk to architects anymore? I mean, they are going to design a lot of what you're interested in. So if you just, think about the vocabulary that you're using, the epistemology, the history of those concepts, that's where you could have guessed I might have gone.
Take them into the field with you. Just take them on in with you.
I think that actually, Seth, I did understand what you were saying, and I was asking a question that I hope would lead you to help us to focus. But the other thing that you might have talked about is your methodology and I was struck by the fact that it was not just a method for students and researchers going out in the field, it's also a method for people in communities to understand themselves and to come to a common understanding with the researchers and the professionals, and the epistemological issue kind of wraps that up very nicely. I think that there's difficulty in the researchers talking to the professionals who are concerned with doing their jobs in particular settings, whether it's a consultancy or a public planning agency. They're very constrained in what they're doing, and they're often the reason they don't want to hear from social scientists is because they don't necessarily want to hear the kinds of things that Don's talking about, because it would mean fundamentally question what they're doing. I mean, this idea, the discussion kind of went directions that I hoped it would go in terms of thinking about, how do you get out in front of the ship, and to some extent that means really thinking about how you recreate the regime that's governing things. I wish there was a way to be more concrete about that rather than hope for a visionary mayor to come along, because you can't always count on governments to be structured that way. But it is something that we can work on. But it does mean that we need professionals who know the jargon and know the technical stuff, but who are prepared to be and capable of being political and not fearful of firing clients when it conflicts with their principles. That's often.
I was going to say that one thing I didn't say. I don't want to be it. Mike, it's just. Oh, you want it? Okay. Because I was going to say to Michael, one of the things that none of us are saying, and we could go around, we are seeing people on the ground taking their own planning and design into their own hands.
Yes.
I was just in San Juan, and we were just in Nairobi. I could go around the room. It's not just do-it-yourself architecture. It's taking over, holding your land in common, finding new ways to protect it from, as they define, gentrification, organizing, spending 10 years in San Juan, not 1 week, or in Dandora, how long was it? 8 years to redo the public. And this is the people themselves with a professional or two who does come along. I mean, I'm not pretending there isn't a role, but there is also a role for us, maybe not me, but for you, in working with these groups that have the knowledge of what they want to change, and then your role is to help them do it. It doesn't have to be, all of us know places, and maybe that's how it's going to happen.
So maybe, it means facilitating the process of seeing, facilitating the process of knowing what you're seeing, thinking of it in the broader context, and then facilitating the process of acting on that.
Can I just add?
Communicate some of those too. We don't talk about those.
Yeah, can I just add an edge to that? Actually quoting my mentor, Professor Thomas Marcus, who was head of the architecture school where I started off. And he made a very sound point that there's always a tension between the academics, the professionals, the people who know what epistemology actually means, and the practitioners. And that ought to be the case. I always like to quote the Latin tag of the University of Liverpool, Haecotia Studio Fodent, which means essentially God has provided the opportunity for us to learn. In other words, in the academy, we have the leisure to ask the big questions and to propose possibilities. And it's very natural that the practitioners, for all the reasons that we understand, will balk against that. I mean, there's a sort of comment about social science from practitioners. They say they want a one-handed social scientist, because social scientists are always saying, well, on the one hand, there's this possibility. On the other hand, they need answers now that will work within their context. And it's right that we should be pushing, and we should be saying, well, actually, there's something else you could do, and don't think of it like that, even though you find this uncomfortable. And they'll say, look, I'll lose my job if I do that. And that's fine, but that we shouldn't be afraid of that debate, because that's the privilege that society gives us.
Great. That might be a good note on which to head out for the martinis that Tigran promised.